The Vanderbilt family, when unlimited wealth wasn't enough. January 1877.
Snow falls on Manhattan, muffling the clatter of horses and carriages along the cobblestones.
In a modest brownstone on Washington Place, a man lies dying.
He is 82 years old.
His body has finally begun to fail after decades of relentless labor, steamships and railroads, battles won against rivals who underestimated money.
Outside, the world continues its commerce, unaware that within walls rests a fortune greater than the United States Treasury itself. $100 million, perhaps more.
The largest private fortune ever accumulated on American soil. The man's name is Cornelius Vanderbilt. They call him the Commodore, and as his breathing grows shallow, as his children and grandchildren gather in the adjacent rooms, a question hangs in the air that no one dares voice aloud.
What happens to all this money now?
The Commodore had spent 7 decades building an empire from nothing. From a borrowed $100 and a single sailboat on supper, he had constructed a transportation network that stretched across the continent.
He had survived economic panics, was the treachery of business partners, and the ceaseless evolution of technology.
He had outlived most of his children. He had buried 2 wives. He had watched America transform from a collection of coastal settlements into an industrial colossus. He had profited from every stage of that transformation. Now, in these final hours, all of that accumulated power and wealth faced ultimate test. Could it survive without him? The answer to that question would unfold across the next century, through 4 generations of Vanderbilts, through the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, through 2 world wars, and a Great Depression, through the rise and fall of the railroad industry itself.
It is a story of palaces built and demolished, fortunes multiplied and squandered, of family members who tried to honor the founder's legacy and others who seemed determined to destroy it.
And at the end, when 120 of the Commodore's descendants, Vanderbilt University, first family, not a single heir remained among them. The greatest fortune in American history had evaporated in less than 100 years. How did this happen? How does a family that once controlled 5% of all the money in circulation lose everything? The answer lies not in any single catastrophe or miscalculation, but in the slow accumulation of choices, some wise, many foolish, all of them shaped by forces that even unlimited wealth could not control. Taxes and technology,
family conflict and social ambition,
the rise of new industries and the decline of old ones, and perhaps most importantly, the simple human truth that making money and keeping money require entirely different skills. To understand the fall of the House of Vanderbilt, we must first understand its rise, and that story begins not in the marble halls of Fifth Avenue, but in the mudflats of Staten Island, where a boy named Cornelius was born into a family of farmers and ferrymen on May 27, 1794. The Vanderbilts had been in America for more than a century by then. Their ancestor, Not soon, had emigrated from the village of Biltmore in Utrecht, Netherlands, arriving in New Amsterdam as an indentured servant in 16. The family name evolved from Vanderbilt, meaning from debuilt, eventually becoming the Americanized Vanderbilt.
For generations, they worked the land on Staten Island, growing vegetables and ferrying produce across the harbor to Manhattan.
They were not poor, but they were not wealthy either.
They existed in that broad middle ground of colonial American life, comfortable but undistinguished, their horizons limited to the waters they could see from their farmhouse windows.
Young Cornelius showed little interest in formal education.
He quit school at age 11 to work full-time on his father's ferry, hauling cargo and passengers between Staten Island and the bustling wharves of Manhattan.
The work was hard, the hours long, and the pay modest, but the boy learned lessons that no classroom could teach. He learned to read the weather and the tides, to judge the character of men by their handshakes and their eyes, calculate profit margins in head while negotiating prices on the... He learned that time was money, that speed and reliability mattered more than elegance, and that the customer who paid promptly deserved better treatment than the one who delayed.
These principles would guide him for the rest of his life.
At 16, Cornelius convinced his mother to lend him $100 to buy his own boat.
It was a Pariager, a shallow draft sailing vessel suitable for the protected waters of New York Harbor.
With this single investment, the future Commodore began his career.
He ferried passengers and freight between Staten Island and Manhattan, undercutting his competitors on price while maintaining a reputation for punctuality and safety.
Within a year,
he had repaid his mother with interest and accumulated a small fleet.
Within 2 years, he had won a government contract to supply provisions to the military posts around New York Harbor during the War of 1812.
By the war's end, he had saved nearly $10,000 and built a reputation as one of the most capable boatmen on the waterfront.
But Cornelius Vanderbilt was never content with mere competence.
He recognized that the future of transportation lay not in sail, steam,
The steamboat was still a novel technology in the 1810s, expensive and unreliable, viewed by many as a dangerous curiosity. Vanderbilt saw something different. He saw a machine that could travel against wind and current, that could keep schedules regardless of weather, that could transform the economics of river and coastal trade. He needed to learn this new technology. He was willing to sacrifice his independence to do so.
In 1818, at the age of 24, Vanderbilt made a decision that seemed to contradict everything he had built.
He sold his fleet of sailing vessels and took a job as a captain working for Thomas Gibbons, a wealthy entrepreneur who operated a steamboat service between New Jersey and New York. For the next decade, Vanderbilt worked as an employee, learning every aspect of steamboat operation while drawing a modest salary. Some observers thought he had lost his ambition. They were wrong.
Vanderbilt was playing a longer game.
He was studying the technology, building relationships with engineers and mechanics, understanding the regulatory and legal landscape that governed interstate commerce.
And he was saving his money.
The Gibbons operation also provided Vanderbilt with education in business warfare.
At the time, Robert Fulton and Robert Livingston held a monopoly on steamboat navigation in New York waters, granted by the state legislature. Any competitor who dared to enter their territory faced seizure of their vessel and possible imprisonment. Gibbons challenged this monopoly in court, and the case eventually reached the Supreme Court of the United States.
In 1824, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in Gibbons v.
Ordered that states could not regulate interstate commerce, that only the federal government held that power.
The decision broke the steamboat monopoly and opened American waters to competition. It was one of the most important rulings in the history of American business, and Cornelius Vanderbilt had witnessed it firsthand. When Gibbons died in 1826, Vanderbilt was ready to strike out on his own again. He was 32 years old, possessed substantial savings, and had mastered the steamboat trade. Over the next 2 decades, he would build an empire on the waters of the eastern seaboard.
His strategy was brutal and effective. He would enter a market with lower prices than his competitors, absorbing losses if necessary to drive them out of business.
Once he had established dominance, he would raise prices to profitable levels. When competitors tried to fight back, he would cut prices again, sustained by reserves they could not match.
When they finally surrendered and paid him to leave the market, he would take their money and move on to the next battlefield.
By the mid-1830s, Vanderbilt was operating more than 100 steamboats and had earned the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. They called him Commodore, the highest rank in the United States Navy, a title that captured both his command of the waterways and serious personality. He was not a pleasant man. He cursed freely, chewed tobacco constantly, showed little patience for social nicety. He treated his competitors with contempt and his employees with harsh discipline.
He paid his workers fairly, but expected absolute loyalty in return.
Those who crossed him learned to regret it.
Those who served him well found themselves rewarded with facility and opportunity.
The Commodore inspired fear more than affection, but he got results.
By 1846, when Vanderbilt was 52 years old, he was a millionaire several times over.
He owned elegant homes, employed dozens of servants, and could have retired to a life of comfortable leisure. Instead, he launched his most ambitious venture yet.
Gold had been discovered in California, and thousands of fortune seekers needed transportation from the East Coast to the goldfields. The conventional route required a voyage around Cape Horn, a journey of months through some of the most dangerous waters on Earth.
Vanderbilt proposed an alternative. He would carry passengers across Nicaragua, using a combination of steamships and carriages to cross the narrow isthmus, then transfer them to Pacific steamers for the final leg to San Francisco.
The route would cut weeks of the journey and cost significantly less than the alternatives.
The Accessory Transit Company, as Vanderbilt named his new enterprise, was a logistical masterpiece.
He negotiated rights from the Nicaraguan government, surveyed routes through jungle and mountain, constructed roads and port facilities, and coordinated schedules of thousands of miles.
The operation was profitable almost from the beginning, carrying thousands of passengers, generating revenues that dwarfed his previous ventures. For the first time, Cornelius Vanderbilt was operating on a continental scale, moving people and goods across hemispheres, competing not just with local rivals but with global enterprises. The Nicaraguan venture also introduced Vanderbilt to a new kind of business challenge. In 1855, while he was traveling in Europe, 2 of his partners, Charles Morgan and Cornelius Garrison, conspired with an American adventurer named William Walker to seize control of the Accessory Transit Company.
Walker, a self-styled filibuster who dreamed of building an American empire in Central America, had led a mercenary force that overthrew the Nicaraguan government. He rewarded Morgan and Garrison by cancelling Vanderbilt's transit concession and granting it to them instead.
The Commodore returned from Europe to find himself robbed of his most profitable enterprise.
His response became legendary. Vanderbilt sent a letter to Morgan and Garrison that concluded with words that would be quoted for generations. "Gentlemen, you have undertaken to cheat me. I won't sue you, for the law is too slow.
I will ruin you." He proceeded to do exactly that.
He financed a military expedition that overthrew Walker's regime, then used his political connections to ensure that the new Nicaraguan government restored his concession. Morgan and Garrison were destroyed. Walker fled Central America and was eventually executed by a firing squad in Honduras.
The Commodore had demonstrated that his reach extended far beyond the courtroom. He could topple governments as easily as competitors. It was a lesson that future adversaries remember. By the late 1850s, Vanderbilt had accumulated a fortune of approximately $30 million, making him one of the wealthiest men in America.
He was in his mid-60s, an age when most men of his generation had long since retired or died.
But the Commodore was not finished. He was about to embark on the phase of his career that would transform him from a wealthy businessman into something unprecedented in American history, a titan whose name would define an era. The railroads called to him.
Vanderbilt had observed the railroad industry for decades, watching as small lines proliferated in the eastern states, each operating according to its own schedule, age, and pricing structure.
The result was chaos. A shipment from New York to Chicago might pass through the hands of a dozen different railroad companies, each requiring separate negotiation, separate payment, separate transfer of goods from one train to another.
The inefficiency was staggering. The opportunity was obvious. Someone with sufficient capital and organizational skill could consolidate these fragmented lines, unified systems, achieving economies of scale that would crush smaller competitors and generate profits that made steamboat revenues look trivial.
In 1863, at the age of 69, Cornelius Vanderbilt began buying stock in the New York and Harlem Railroad.
It was a modest line, running from downtown Manhattan up through the city and into the suburbs, considered by most investors to be nearly worthless.
The Commodore saw something different. He saw that the Harlem was the only railroad permitted to run steam locomotives into the heart of Manhattan, giving it a strategic position that no competitor could match. He also saw that the railroad's management was incompetent, its operations inefficient, its stock price depressed far below its true value. He began accumulating shares quietly, avoiding attention until he had acquired a controlling interest.
Then he installed his eldest son, William Henry, as vice president and began the work of transformation. The Harlem was just the beginning.
Over the next decade, Vanderbilt acquired the Hudson River Railroad, the New York Central Railroad, and the Lake Shore and Michigan Southern Railway. Each acquisition followed the same pattern.
He would identify a strategically important line, buy shares until he controlled the board of directors, replace incompetent management with his own people, improve operations, and integrate the new property into his expanded network. By 1873, he had created the New York Central System, a railroad empire stretching from the Atlantic coast to the shores of Lake Michigan, capable of moving passengers straight from New York to Chicago without changing trains.
The scale of Vanderbilt's achievement was difficult for contemporaries to comprehend. His railroad system employed tens of thousands of workers, operated thousands of miles of track, and generated revenues measured in tens of millions of dollars annually. He had standardized schedules, equipment, and procedures across multiple states. He had built Grand Central Depot, a magnificent terminal on 42nd Street in Manhattan, served as the gateway to his empire. He had transformed the railroad from a speculative investment into a stable, dividend-paying enterprise that attracted capital from across the Atlantic. And he had done all of this in his 70s, an age when most men could barely walk. The construction of Grand Central Depot, completed in 1871, was perhaps the Commodore's most visible monument. The station occupied an entire city block, its iron and glass train shed arching over the track, cathedral to modern transportation.
Passengers arrived to find elevated platforms, separate waiting rooms for different classes, and amenities unheard of in earlier railroad travel.
The station announced to New York and the world that the railroad age had arrived. Vanderbilt's system represented the pinnacle of American enterprise. The Commodore had built something that would endure for generations. But even as the Commodore reached the summit of his power, forces were gathering that would eventually undermine everything.
Some of these forces were external. Changes in technology, government regulation, in the competitive landscape.
Others were internal. Conflicts within the family, disagreements about strategy, the inevitable difficulty of transferring leadership from founder to his heirs. The Commodore could see some of these challenges clearly. Others remained invisible until long after his death.
Consider the problem of succession.
Cornelius Vanderbilt had fathered 13 children with his first wife, Sophia Johnson, whom he had married in 1813. when they were both teenagers. Sophia was a capable woman who managed the household while her husband built his empire, but she received little credit for her contributions, even less of her husband's attention. The Commodore was frequently absent, conducting business in distant cities, and when he was home, he often proved difficult and demanding. Of their 13 children, 11 survived to adulthood.
The sons proved disappointing to their father.
The eldest surviving son, William Henry, had suffered a nervous breakdown as a young man and been exiled to a farm on Staten Island, where his father expected him to live out his days in obscurity. The other sons showed little aptitude for business and even less inclination to learn. Cornelius Jeremiah, youngest son, was a gambler and debtor who would eventually commit suicide.
The daughters, according to the customs of the era, were not considered suitable for business leadership, regardless of abilities.
The Commodore's contempt for women was legendary. He left each of his 8 surviving daughters approximately $500,000 in his will, substantial sums but tiny fractions of the total estate. He expected them to marry well and stay out of his way.
William Henry, however, surprised everyone.
Banished to Staten Island as a failure, he had quietly transformed the family farm into a profitable operation.
More importantly, he had proven himself a capable manager of the Staten Island Railway, a small line that his father had acquired as an afterthought.
When the Commodore began consolidating his railroad empire in the 1860s, he needed someone he could trust to handle day-to-day operations.
William Henry, now in his 40s, demonstrated test abilities his father had never recognized. He was systematic where his father was intuitive, diplomatic where his father was abrasive, patient where his father was impulsive.
The old man, grudgingly at first, then with growing respect, brought William Henry into the heart of the railroad operation. By the time of the Commodore's death in January 1877, William Henry Vanderbilt had been running the New York Central System for nearly a decade. He understood its operations intimately, knew its key personnel, and had the trust of both employees and investors. The transition of leadership proceeded smoothly,
but the transition of wealth proved more contentious.
The Commodore's will, when it was read, revealed the full measure of his ambitions and his prejudices.
The bulk of his fortune, approximately $90 million, went to William Henry.
The grandsons received smaller but still substantial rests.
The daughters received their pittances.
Cornelius Jeremiah, the wayward son, received only the income from a $200,000 trust fund, a gesture of contempt from beyond the grave. The Commodore had decided that his fortune should remain concentrated, that division among many heirs would weaken the empire he had built.
He trusted William Henry to continue his work, eventually to pass the fortune to the next generation intact.
The will was challenged almost immediately.
2 of the Commodore's daughters and his disinherited son Cornelius Jeremiah sued, claiming that their father had been mentally incompetent when he signed the document. He had been unduly influenced by William Henry and by spiritualists who claimed to communicate with the dead.
The trial that followed, lasting months and filling newspapers with lurid testimony about the Commodore's final years, exposed the family's dysfunction to public view.
Witnesses described the old man's failing health, his interest in his ANCs and mediums, his volatile temper, and his complicated relationship with children.
The proceedings revealed a family united by blood and money, but divided by resentment, jealousy, and long-nurtured grievances. In the end, William Henry prevailed.
The courts upheld the will, and the fortune remained concentrated in his hands.
But the experience left scars.
William Henry, seeking to avoid future litigation, and perhaps motivated by a generosity his father lacked, agreed to pay his sisters an additional $500,000 each and to provide ongoing support for his troubled brother. He also began thinking about how to distribute his own estate when the time came, determined to avoid the spectacle that followed his father's death.
William Henry Vanderbilt faced a challenge that few men in history had confronted.
He had inherited the largest private fortune in the world, a fortune that generated income faster than any individual could spend it.
He controlled a railroad system that employed more than 40,000 workers and served millions of passengers and shippers annually. He was, by any measure, the most powerful private citizen in America, and he was deeply uncomfortable with his position.
Unlike his father, William Henry had no appetite for public combat.
He disliked the attention that wealth attracted, constant requests for charity, the hostile scrutiny from newspapers and politicians. He managed the railroad system competently, expanding its reach and increasing its profitability, but he found no joy in the work. His true passions were art and horses. He assembled one of the finest private art collections in America, filling his homes with masterpieces by old masters and contemporary painters. He bred and raced trotting horses, finding in the stables a peace that boardrooms could never provide.
He was, in many ways, a simple man who happened to control an extraordinary fortune. William Henry's most notorious moment came in an 1883 interview with a reporter who asked whether the Vanderbilt Railroad served the public interest. His response would be quoted, often out of context, for generations. The public be damned.
In full, he was explaining that the railroad existed to serve its shareholders, not to provide unprofitable services simply because the public demanded them.
But the truncated version captured something true about the Vanderbilt approach to business.
The family had built its fortune by pursuing profit relentlessly, by crushing competitors, maximizing returns, by treating transportation as a commodity to be bought and sold rather than a public trust to be administered.
The Commodore had never pretended otherwise. William Henry was merely stating the principle plainly.
The public, and more importantly the politicians, did not appreciate the candor.
The 1880s saw growing agitation for railroad regulation, demands that the government intervene to prevent monopolistic pricing and ensure fair treatment for farmers and small businesses.
The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 established the first federal regulatory agency to oversee the railroads, requiring published rates and prohibiting various discriminatory practices.
The era of unfettered railroad expansion was ending. The era of government oversight beginning. The implications for the Vanderbilt fortune would take decades to become fully apparent. William Henry died suddenly on December 8, 1885, suffering a stroke during a business meeting. He was 64 years old and had controlled the Vanderbilt fortune for less than 9 years.
In that time, he had nearly doubled it. His estate was valued at approximately $200 million, a figure that staggered contemporaries and remains impressive even after adjustment for inflation. In today's terms, William Henry Vanderbilt died with a fortune worth tens of billions of dollars. He was, at the moment of his death, the wealthiest man in American history. And then, in a decision that would shape the family's trajectory for generations, he divided the fortune among heirs.
Unlike his father, William Henry distributed his wealth broadly. His widow received a substantial bequest. Each of his 4 sons received significant shares of the estate, though the 2 eldest, Cornelius II and William Kissam, received considerably more than their young brothers. The daughters and their husbands received generous portions.
Charitable institutions, including Vanderbilt University, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and various churches and hospitals, received unprecedented gifts. The concentration that the Commodore had insisted upon was broken. The Vanderbilt fortune would never again be controlled by a single individual.
William Henry's decision was understandable from multiple perspectives.
He wanted to avoid the legal battles that had followed his father's death. He wanted to provide for all of his children, not just the eldest.
He may have believed optimistically that his sons would cooperate to maintain the family's railroad interests even as they pursued their ambitions.
But the practical effect was to fragment the economic power that his father had spent a lifetime assembling.
Instead of one Vanderbilt controlling the New York Central system, multiple Vanderbilts now held significant stakes, each with their own interests, their own advisors, their own ideas about how the fortune should be managed. The 3rd generation of Vanderbilts, the grandchildren of the Commodore, came of age in a different world than their predecessors.
They had never known poverty, never struggled to build a business from nothing, never faced the existential challenges that shaped their grandfather's character.
They inherited not just money, but social position, the expectation that they would take their places among leaders of a...
And they inherited something else as well, the burden of living up to a legend. Cornelius Vanderbilt, too, the eldest grandson, seemed best positioned to carry on the family tradition. He was hardworking, devout, and committed to the railroad business that had built the family fortune. He served as chairman of the New York Central and was acknowledged as the head of the family.
His wife, Alice Claypool Gwynn, was a woman of intelligence and taste, and together they sought to establish the Vanderbilts as leaders not just of commerce, but of society.
Their summer home in Newport, Rhode Island, would become the most famous of all the Vanderbilt mansions, a monument to wealth that still stands today as a testament to Gilded Age excess.
That mansion, called the Breakers, requires some description to understand the scale of Vanderbilt ambition at its peak.
Cornelius too hired the architect Richard Morris Hunt, the same man who had designed several of his relatives' homes and who would later design the base of the Statue of Liberty. Hunt created an Italian Renaissance palazzo of 70 rooms, occupying nearly an acre of floor space, overlooking the Atlantic Ocean from a dramatic cliffside setting.
The main hall rose more than 50 feet to a painted ceiling.
The dining room could seat dozens of guests at a table surrounded by rare marbles imported from Africa and Italy. The breakfast room was covered in silver gilt. The kitchen, located in a separate building to reduce fire risk, connected to the main house by an underground tunnel. The Breakers cost approximately $7 million to build, a a sum equivalent to hundreds of millions in today's currency.
It employed dozens of servants year-round, even though the family occupied it for only a few weeks each summer during Newport's social season.
The annual operating costs were staggering. Fuel for heating, wages for staff, maintenance for grounds, provisions for guests. The house was not really a home at all, but a stage set for entertainment. A weapon in the social wars that consumed New York's elite. And the Breakers was just one of several Vanderbilt mansions. In Manhattan, Cornelius II constructed the largest private residence in the city's history, a Chateau-style palace occupying an entire block on Fifth Avenue between 57th and 58th Streets. His brother William Kissam built his own mansion further downtown, a French Renaissance confection designed by Hunt to showcase the artistic taste of William's ambitious wife, Elva.
Their father's triple palace at 645th Avenue, where William Henry had lived his final years, still stood as well.
For a few decades at the turn of the century, Vanderbilts owned more prime real estate on Fifth Avenue than any other family in the city. Their homes strung along the boulevard, wells on and each trying to outdo the others in size and splendor. The mansion building was partly a competition for social status.
New York's established families, the descendants of colonial merchants and Dutch landowners, had long looked down upon the Vanderbilts as mover rich, as crude railroad people whose money could not purchase breeding.
The social leader of this old guard was Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, known simply as Mrs. Astor, who maintained a strict hierarchy of acceptable families and hosted exclusive balls to which the Vanderbilts were ridiculously invited. The Vanderbilt women, particularly Elva Vanderbilt, were determined to break through this barrier. Elva's strategy was audacious. She commissioned a mansion so magnificent that Mrs. Astor could not ignore it, then announced a costume ball so elaborate that anyone who mattered in New York society would have to attend or admit their irrelevance. The ball, held in March 1883, became one of the most famous parties in American history. Guests arrived in costumes costing thousands of dollars, representing historical figures, fairy tale characters, and mythological beings. The newspapers covered every detail, describing the decorations, food, the entertainment, and most importantly, who was there. Mrs. Astor attended, effectively conceding that the Vanderbilts had arrived. The social barrier was broken, but victories in society came at a cost.
The 1883 ball reportedly cost more than $250,000, equivalent to several million today, for a single evening's entertainment. And it was just the beginning. Once admitted to the highest circles, the Vanderbilts were expected to maintain their position through continuous display.
More parties, more gowns, more jewels, more servants, more travel. The obligations of wealth proved almost as demanding as the work of creating it, considerably less productive.
The third generation's relationship with the family business was complicated.
Cornelius too served dutifully as chairman of the New York Central, attending meetings, reviewing reports, and maintaining relationships with bankers and politicians.
But he had neither his grandfather's ruthless drive nor his father's patient competence.
The railroad system had grown too large and too complex for any single individual to master, and professional managers increasingly handled day-to-day operations. Cornelius II's role became ceremonial, family representative, lending the Vanderbilt name to decisions made by others.
When he suffered a stroke in 1896, he withdrew from active involvement entirely, spending his final years as an invalid in his Newport palace. William Kissam Vanderbilt, the second son, showed even less interest in the railroad business.
He preferred yachts and horses, spending his fortune on racing syndicates and sailing competitions. He built a country estate on Long Island called Idle Hour, where he could indulge his passion for sport far from the pressures of commerce.
His marriage to Alva, which had produced the famous costume ball, ended in divorce in 1885, one of the first divorces in American high society, and a scandal that fascinated the public.
Alva received a settlement of approximately $10 million, went on to marry Oliver Hazard Perry Beaumont, banker and sportsman whose family had their own Newport cottage.
William Kissam eventually remarried as well, but he never returned to active involvement in the railroad interests.
The younger sons, Frederick and George Washington Vanderbilt II, carved out their own paths. Frederick became a gentleman banker, serving on numerous boards and managing his investments with conservative competence. He built mansions in Hyde Park, New York, and Bar Harbor, Maine, living a life of quiet elegance, without the social ambitions that drove his older brothers. George, the youngest, was perhaps the most interesting of the siblings.
Scholarly and introverted, he showed little interest in society or business.
Instead, he conceived a vision that would result in the most ambitious Vanderbilt construction project of all. George Washington Vanderbilt II decided to build an estate in the mountains of North Carolina that would combine all of his passions: architecture, forestry, agriculture, and the creation of a self-sustaining community based on scientific principles. He purchased more than 120,000 acres of worn-out farmland and eroded forest in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Hired the architect Richard Morris Hunt, landscape designer Law Olmsted, and began constructing what would become the largest private residence in America. He called it Biltmore. The Biltmore House, completed in 1895, contained 250 rooms spread across more than 4 acres of floor space. It was larger than any of the Newport cottages, larger than any palace in Europe that was still privately owned, larger than some European castles that had been built to house armies. George filled it with art and books, with tapestries and antiques collected during years of travel.
But Biltmore was more than a house.
It was an experiment in estate management, a working farm and forest that George hoped would demonstrate how scientific methods could restore damaged land and provide sustainable income. The estate's forestry program, launched under the direction of Gifford Pinchot and later Carl Schenck, became one of the most influential in American history. Pinchot would later become the first chief of the United States Forest Service. The methods developed at Biltmore helped shape national policy for managing public lands.
Schenck founded the Biltmore Forest School, first forestry school in America, training young foresters who carried scientific principles across the country.
In this sense, George's vision was realized.
Biltmore did make a lasting contribution to American land management.
But the financial realities of maintaining such an estate proved challenging from the beginning. The annual operating costs were enormous.
Staff salaries, maintenance, taxes, and supplies consumed hundreds of thousands of dollars each year. The farms and forests generated some revenue, but nowhere near enough to cover expenses.
George supported the operation from his personal fortune, but even Vanderbilt wealth had limits.
When he died unexpectedly in 14, at the age of 51, his widow Edith faced difficult decisions about how to preserve his legacy with bankruptcy.
Edith Vanderbilt proved more practical than her husband. She sold nearly 90,000 acres to the federal government, creating what became Pisgah National Forest. She opened the house to paying visitors, transforming a private residence into a tourist attraction.
She could staff, simplified operations, and focus resources on maintaining the house and its immediate grounds. Under her leadership, later under the leadership of descendants, Biltmore survived where other Vanderbilt properties did not.
Today, it remains in the family's hands, the only major Vanderbilt mansion still operated by Vanderbilt descendants, a remarkable exception to the general pattern evolution.
But Biltmore's survival should not obscure the larger trend. By the early 20th century, Vanderbilt fortune was already in decline. Not in absolute terms, not yet, but in relative terms and in the family's ability to maintain its position at the pinnacle of wealth. New fortunes were being made in oil, in steel, in finance, fortunes that dwarfed what the Commodore had accumulated in railroads.
The Rockefellers, Carnegies, the Morgans, the Fricks commanded resources that Vanderbilts look almost modest by comparison. The railroad industry itself, once the cutting edge of American capitalism, was becoming mature and regulated, explosive growth phase over. Its monopoly profits constrained by government act competition from colleges.
The introduction of the federal income tax in 1913 created another pressure on inherited wealth.
For the first time, the Vanderbilts and families like them faced systematic taxation of their annual income, not just occasional levies on property and actions.
The rates began low but rose quickly, especially after America's entry into World War I created enormous government financing needs. By the 1920s, wealthy families might pay 25% or more of its income to the federal government.
For families that depended on investment income rather than active business, this represented a significant drain on capital.
The estate tax, also introduced in the early 20th century, created an even more direct threat to concentrated wealth.
Each time a fortune passed from one generation to the next, a substantial portion went to the government. Combined with the tendency of wealthy families to divide estates among heirs, the estate tax accelerated the fragmentation of great fortunes. What the Commodore had spent a lifetime concentrating, tax code now worked to disperse. The story of Cornelius Vanderbilt's early years deserves closer examination, for it reveals the foundations upon which everything else was built. He was born in a small farmhouse on Staten Island, the fourth of 9 children in a family that had known neither wealth nor distinction for generations.
His father, also named Cornelius, was a man of limited ambition, who divided his time between farming and operating a small boat that carried vegetables and livestock to the markets of Manhattan.
His mother, Phoebe Hand, was a woman of stronger character, frugal and industrious, who instilled in her son the values that guide him throughout his life.
She taught him that money saved was money earned, that debt was a form of slavery, that a man's word was his bond. These lessons, absorbed in childhood, would prove more valuable than any formal education.
The young Cornelius showed no aptitude. He could barely read and write throughout his life, signing documents abroad that even sympathetic observers described as semi-literate.
But he possessed other gifts that his teachers could not measure. He had an instinctive understanding of commerce, a natural ability to calculate profit and loss, an uncanny sense for what goods were worth and what people would pay. He could negotiate with grown men before he was 10 years old, haggling over the price of produce with the same tenacity he would later bring to railroad negotiations. And he had something that no amount of education could provide, an absolute determination to secure $100 that his mother lent him in 10 when he was 16 years old. Represented an enormous sum for a family of their circumstances.
B.B. Vanderbilt had saved that money over years of careful economy, setting aside small amounts from the household budget whenever possible. She lent it to her son because she believed in his ability, but she recognized something in his father had never possessed.
The loan came with conditions.
Cornelius had to pay her back with interest. He had to continue helping with the family's farming and ferrying operations, and he had to prove that her faith was justified. He proved it spectacularly.
Within months, he had established a reputation as the most reliable boatman on Staten Island. His Voyager, which he named the Swifter, made the crossing between Staten Island and Manhattan faster and more safely than any competitor.
He charged lower prices than his rivals, but provided better service.
He worked longer hours, starting before dawn and continuing until dark, 7 days a week when business warranted. He slept on his boat when necessary, ate cold meals while sailing, sacrificed every comfort to the relentless pursuit of profit. By the end of his first year, he had repaid his mother's loan with interest and accumulated capital for expansion. The War of 1812 provided opportunities that a young entrepreneur could hardly have imagined.
The British Navy threatened American commerce. The government needed reliable transportation to supply the military posts around York Harbor. Cornelius Vanderbilt, now 18 years old, on a contract to provision Fort Richmond, Fort Tompkins, and other installations on Staten Island and Long Island. The work was demanding and sometimes dangerous, requiring him to navigate waters where enemy vessels might appear at any moment. But the pay was good, and the experience taught him lessons about logistics and organization that would prove invaluable later. By the end of the war, Vanderbilt had assembled a small fleet of sailing vessels and accumulated savings of nearly $10,000.
He was, by the standards of his community, a successful man.
He had married his cousin Sophia Johnson in 1813, despite his parents' objections, and they had begun raising a family that would eventually include 13 children.
He could have continued in the coastal trade, expanding gradually, enjoying the modest prosperity that his hard work had earned.
But Cornelius Vanderbilt was not built for modest prosperity. He wanted more. The steamboat fascinated him. Robert Fulton had demonstrated the technology's potential in 1807. When his vessel Clermont traveled from New York to Albany in just 32 hours, a journey that sailing ships required days to complete. The steamboat could travel against wind and current, could maintain schedules regardless of weather, could carry more passengers and cargo than any sailing vessel of comparable size.
Vanderbilt saw immediately that steam would transform maritime commerce, but the man who mastered this technology would dominate the waters where he had grown up.
The question was how to acquire the knowledge and capital necessary to enter this new industry. His decision to work for Thomas Gibbons was strategic brilliance disguised as humble employment.
Gibbons was wealthy, well-connected, and locked in a legal battle with the boat monopoly that controlled New York waters. By joining Gibbons' operation, Vanderbilt gained access to steamboat technology, learned the intricacies of business, and observed firsthand the legal strategies that would eventually break the monopoly. He also earned a salary that allowed him to continue saving capital for the day when he would strike out on his own again.
Sophia Vanderbilt played a crucial role during the years. While her husband captained steamboats for Gibbons, she operated a hotel and tavern near the New Jersey ferry landing, providing meals and lodging for passengers waiting to cross to New York.
The establishment, called Bologna Hall, developed a reputation for cleanliness and good food that attracted customers from across the region. Sophia managed every aspect of the operation, from hiring staff to purchasing supplies to handling difficult guests.
The profits he generated supplemented husband's salary and added to the family savings. The Vanderbilts were a team, both partners contributing to the common goal of accumulation. The Supreme Court's decision in Gibbons v.
Ogden in 1824 was a turning point not just for Cornelius Vanderbilt, but for American economic history.
Chief Justice John Marshall's ruling that states could not regulate interstate commerce opened the waterways to competition, broke the steamboat monopoly, established a principle that would shape American business for centuries.
Vanderbilt had witnessed the entire struggle from the inside, had learned how legal battles were fought and won, had seen how political connections could be deployed to achieve commercial objectives. These lessons would serve him well in later conflicts.
When Gibbons died in 1826, Vanderbilt was ready to build his own empire. He was 32 years old, possessed substantial savings, had mastered every aspect of steamboat business, and understood the competitive landscape as well as anyone in the industry. Over the next 3 decades, he would construct a transportation network that spanned the eastern seaboard and reached across continents.
His methods were brutal, his competitors often destroyed, his reputation fearsome.
But no one who studied his career could deny his genius. The steamboat was of the 1830s, and 1,840 seconds demonstrated Vanderbilt's approach to competition.
When he entered a market, he cut prices ruthlessly, absorbing losses that were bankrupted.
He ran his boats on schedule regardless of profitability, building a reputation for reliability that attracted customers even when rivals offered lower fares.
He improved his vessels constantly, investing in better engines, more comfortable accommodations, faster hulls.
When competitors finally surrendered, paying him to leave the market rather than face continued destruction, he took their money and moved on to the next battlefield.
The most famous of these arrangements involved the Hudson River steamboat trade.
Vanderbilt had built up a fleet of boats operating between New York and Albany, competing fiercely with the established lines. After years of warfare, his rivals concluded that paying him to stop was cheaper than continuing to fight.
They agreed to give him $50,000 per year if he would withdraw from the Hudson River trade and not return. Vanderbilt accepted the deal and redirected his attention to Long Island Sound and routes between New York and New England.
The arrangement was legal but morally questionable, a kind of legalized extortion that earned him criticism from reformers and journalists.
Vanderbilt was unconcerned.
He was in business to make money, not friends. The California gold rush of 1849 presented an opportunity unlike any Vanderbilt had. Thousands of fortune seekers needed transportation from the East Coast to the goldfields, and conventional routes were slow, dangerous, and expensive.
The voyage around Cape Horn took months and passed through some of the most treacherous waters on Earth. The overland routes across the American continent required weeks of travel through wilderness, Native American attacks, and simple exhaustion claimed many lives. Vanderbilt proposed a faster, safer alternative, transit across Nicaragua. A combination of carriages could carry passengers frantic in days rather than months.
The Accessory Transit Company, which Vanderbilt organized to exploit this route, was his most ambitious venture to date. He personally surveyed the Nicaragua route, traveling through jungle and swamp to identify the best passages for vessels. He negotiated with the Nicaraguan government for transit rights, promising to pay royalties that would benefit the impoverished nation. He built roads and port facilities, purchased steamboats for both oceans, and organized a system of connections that moved passengers with unprecedented efficiency. The operation was profitable almost from the beginning, carrying as many as 20,000 passengers per year, generating revenues that dwarfed his previous enterprises. The Nicaragua venture also introduced Vanderbilt to the complexities of international business.
His dealings with the Central American government, his conflicts with British interests in the region, and his eventual confrontation with the filibuster William Walker taught him that commercial success required more than good management. It required political skill, military capability, and a willingness to use force when necessary. Vanderbilt demonstrated all of these qualities in his campaign to overthrow Walker's regime and reclaim his transit concession.
The Commodore who emerged from the Nicaragua experience was harder, more ruthless, and more powerful than the steamboat operator who had entered it. By the late 1850s, Cornelius Vanderbilt had accumulated a fortune of approximately $30 million.
He was in his mid-60s, older than most men of his generation would ever live. He had already accomplished more than a dozen ordinary men could achieve in kind lifetimes. He could have retired to a life of comfort, enjoying the wealth he had earned, watching his children and grandchildren carry on without him.
Instead, he turned his attention to the railroads. The railroad industry in 1860 was chaotic and fragmented. Hundreds of small lines operated throughout the eastern states, each with its own schedule, gauge, and pricing structure. A shipment from New York to Chicago might pass through the hands of a dozen different companies, each requiring separate negotiation and payment, each transferring goods from one train to another at junction points where delays were inevitable. The inefficiency was obvious to anyone who studied the industry.
What was not obvious was how to consolidate these disparate elements into a unified system.
Vanderbilt began his railroad career by purchasing stock in the New York and Harlem Railroad, a modest line running from Lower Manhattan north through and into Westchester County. Harlem was widely considered a poor investment, its track in disrepair, its management incompetent, stock price depressed. But Vanderbilt saw what others missed: The Harlem was the only railroad permitted to operate steam locomotives in the heart of Manhattan, giving it a strategic position that no competitor could replicate. Control the Harlem, and you controlled access to the largest city in America. The acquisition of the Harlem demonstrated Vanderbilt's mastery of financial warfare.
He accumulated shares quietly, avoiding attention until he had assembled a substantial position. When his intentions became known, speculators who had bet against the railroad found themselves trapped.
They had sold shares short, promising to deliver stock they did not own at prices they could not afford.
As Vanderbilt bought up the available supply, the price rose inexorably, squeezing the shorts into bankruptcy or surrender.
The episode became famous as one of the great market corners of the era, a demonstration of how concentrated capital could crush smaller players. The Hudson River Railroad fell next, acquired through similar methods. In the New York Central, the largest and most important line in the state, each acquisition followed the same pattern.
Vanderbilt would identify a strategic property, accumulate shares until he controlled the board, replace incompetent management with his own people, and integrate the new property into his expanding network.
The process was expensive, requiring millions of dollars in capital and years of patient maneuvering.
But the result was a railroad empire unlike anything that had existed before.
The consolidation of the New York Central system in 1869 marked the culmination of Vanderbilt's railroad career.
The combined entity controlled thousands of miles of track stretching from the Atlantic coast to the shores of Lake Michigan.
It employed tens of thousands of workers, operated thousands of locomotives and rail cars, and generated revenues measured in tens of millions of dollars annually.
Vanderbilt had standardized schedules, equipment, and procedures across multiple states.
He had created efficiencies that reduced costs and improved service. He had transformed the railroad from a speculative investment into a stable, dividend-paying enterprise that attracted capital from around the world.
The construction of Grand Central Depot, completed in 1871, provided a physical monument to Vanderbilt's achievement.
The station occupied an entire city block at 42nd Street. Its iron and glass train shed spanning the track, cathedral to modern transportation.
Passengers entered through a grand fart, found themselves in spaces designed to impress. Waiting rooms with high ceilings, platforms elevated above amenities that never more comfortable had ever been before.
Grand Central announced to New York and the world that the railroad age had arrived. Vanderbilt's system represented the pinnacle of American enterprise.
The Erie War of 1868 provided a counterpoint to Vanderbilt's triumph. Attempting to gain control of the Erie Railroad, competed with his New York Central on routes between New York and the West, Vanderbilt found himself outmaneuvered by a group of speculators led by Jay Gould and Fisk.
These men, more ruthless even than the Commodore, issued watered stock to dilute Vanderbilt's holdings, bribed legislators to legalize their manipulations, and eventually fled to New Jersey with suitcases full of cash to avoid arrest.
Vanderbilt lost an estimated several $1 million in the debacle, and was forced to abandon his pursuit of the Erie.
The Erie War taught Vanderbilt that even unlimited wealth could not guarantee victory. Gould and Fisk had demonstrated that cunning and corruption could defeat capital power when deployed skillfully. The Commodore learned from the experience, becoming more cautious in his later investments, more attentive to the political landscape that shaped business outcomes. He had been reminded that commercial warfare was unpredictable, that even the strongest fighter could lose when facing opponents without scruple.
The final years of Cornelius Vanderbilt's life were marked by tragedy and controversy. His first wife, Sophia, who had been his partner since adolescence, died in 1868 after a long illness. Within a year, the 75-year-old Vanderbilt married Frank Armstrong Crawford, a young woman from Alabama who was 43 years his junior.
The marriage scandalized New York society and raised questions about the old man's judgment.
His children were horrified. His business associates were bemused.
But Vanderbilt seemed happy with his young bride, and she provided companionship in his declining years. The relationship with his children remained complicated until the end. Cornelius Jeremiah, the youngest surviving son, continued to embarrass the family with his gambling and debts.
The daughters resented their exclusion from the business and their modest inheritances.
Even William Henry, who had proven himself capable, never fully escaped his father's shadow.
The Commodore's love was conditional, dependent on performance, withdrawn when expectations were not met.
He was, by all accounts, a terrible father and a worse husband, devoted to his business in ways he could never be devoted to his family. When death finally came on January 4, 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt lived 82 years and accumulated the largest fortune in American history. The newspapers devoted pages to his biography, counting his rise from Staten Island ferryman to railroad king. Some praised him as a captain of a man who had built the transportation infrastructure both possible.
Others condemned him as a robber baron, whose ruthless methods had crushed competitors and exploited workers. Both characterizations contained truth.
The Commodore was a complex figure who defied simple categorization. The will that he left behind reflected his values and his prejudices.
Nearly $90 million went to William Henry, on the theory that concentrated wealth would preserve the family's power better than heirs. The grandsons received smaller, but still substantial amounts. The daughters received their pittances.
Cornelius Jeremiah was effectively disinherited, receiving only the income from a trust too small to support his extravagant lifestyle.
The arrangements guaranteed conflict, as the excluded heirs immediately began legal challenges that dragged on for months. William Henry Vanderbilt's brief tenure as family head, from 1877 to 1885, represented the high watermark of Vanderbilt wealth and power.
He doubled the fortune he inherited, expanded the railroad system, and maintained the family's position at the pinnacle of America.
But his decision to divide the estate among his heirs ensured that no future Vanderbilt would wield the concentrated power that he and his father had enjoyed.
The fragmentation had begun. The third generation's relationship with money was fundamentally different from their predecessors. Cornelius II and William Kissam had never known poverty, had never struggled to build a business from nothing, had never faced the existential challenges that shaped their grandfather. They inherited not just wealth but expectations, the assumption that Vanderbilt meant success, that the family would always occupy its position at the summit of American society. These expectations proved both motivating and constraining.
The grandchildren worked to honor the legacy, even as they enjoyed its benefits. But they lacked the hunger that had driven the Commodore, fierce determination that comes only from having nothing to lose.
The mansion building of the 1880s and 1892, an attempt to convert financial capital into social capital, use wealth to purchase the acceptance that old money had denied.
William Kissam's wife, Alva, was the driving force behind much of this effort. He recognized that New York society was governed by rules as rigid as any business, but admission required not just money, but the appearance of cultural sophistication. He hired the best architects, collected the finest art, and threw parties of such magnificence that even her critics had to acknowledge her achievement. When Mrs. Astor finally called on Alva Vanderbilt, 400 accepted the family as peers. The campaign had succeeded.
But the cost of this success was substantial.
The mansions consumed capital at an alarming rate, not just in their construction, but in their maintenance.
A house like the Breakers required dozens of servants, constant repairs, and operating expenses that rivaled the budgets of small businesses. And the mansions were only the beginning.
To maintain social position required expensive wardrobes, elaborate entertaining, European travel, and countless other expenditures that drained resources as fast as investments could replenish them.
The Vanderbilts were wealthy enough to afford this lifestyle, but only barely. And only so long as the railroad continued to generate reliable returns. The fourth generation of Vanderbilts, the great-grandchildren of Commodore, came of age during World War I and the Roaring Twenties.
They had even less connection to the railroad business parents, even less experience with work or discipline, or the management of complex enterprises.
They had grown up in palaces, attended by servants, insulated from ordinary life by layers of wealth and privilege. They were, in many ways, first Vanderbilts to be purely consumers of the family fortune, rather than contributors to it.
Consider the children of Cornelius Vanderbilt too, the hard-working grandson who had built the Breakers and served as chairman of the New York Central. His eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt too, showed promise but died of typhoid fever at age 21 while a student at Yale. His second son, Cornelius Vanderbilt III, known as Naley, committed what his parents considered an unforgivable sin. He married for love.
The object of Naylor's affection was Grace Graham Wilson, a beautiful young woman from a respectable family, that not quite respectable enough to Vanderbilt standards. Grace's family had made their money in business, but they lacked the social credentials that Vanderbilts, so recently admitted to society themselves, now demanded.
When Naley announced his intention to marry Grace against his parents' wishes, father flew into a rage.
Cornelius, too, who had worked so hard to establish the family's social position, could not accept a daughter-in-law who might embarrass them. He threatened to disinherit Naley entirely. The confrontation may have contributed to Cornelius' stroke in 1896.
He never fully recovered. When he died in 1899, his will reflected his continuing anger. Naley received only $500,000 and a trust fund of $1 million, a tiny fraction of what he received.
His younger brother Alfred Gwynn Vanderbilt inherited the bulk of the estate, approximately $43 million, and became the new head of the family. The decision was devastating to Naley, who felt he had been punished for following his heart. It was also devastating the principle of family unity, demonstrating that love and money could not easily coexist in the Vanderbilt world.
Nellie and Grace lived well enough on their reduced circumstances, but they were effectively exiled families in a circle.
Their son, Cornelius Vanderbilt IV, would later write memoirs describing the strange experience of bearing the most famous name in American business while having little access to the fortune it represented. The family's conflicts had become public, its divisions permanent.
The united front that the Commodore had tried to establish was shattered beyond repair.
Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, who inherited the family leadership after his father's death, seemed well suited to the role. He was handsome, athletic, and sociable, a man who moved easily through the highest circles of American and European society. He maintained the family's railroad interests, serving on the board of the New York Central, while pursuing his passion for coaching, competitive sport of driving four-horse carriages. He was generous to his relatives, providing support for Nellie and others who had fallen out of favor.
He seemed likely to restore harmony to the family and to maintain its position for another generation.
Then came May 7, 1915. Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt was aboard the IMS Lusitania when a German submarine torpedoed the British ocean liner off the coast of Ireland. The ship sank in 18 minutes, taking nearly 1,200 passengers and crew to their deaths. Alfred, who could not swim, gave his life jacket to a woman with a small child, went down with the ship. He was 37 years old. The loss devastated the family and deprived it of perhaps its most capable leader of that generation. Alfred's estate, worth approximately $26 million at the time of his death, was divided among children and second wife.
His brother Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt now stood as the senior male of his branch of the family, but Reginald was no Alfred.
He was, in fact, exactly the kind of heir that wealthy families fear. Charming but irresponsible, more interested in pleasure than in preservation. Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt had inherited approximately $7.5 million when he came of age, plus the income from a $5 million trust fund established by his father. On the night of his 21st birthday, he reportedly gambled away $70,000 in a single evening. It was a harbinger of things to come. Reginald's primary interests were racehorses, gambling, and drinking. He served briefly as a vice president of New York Central, but his contribution to the family business was negligible.
He preferred the company of sporting men to bankers, the atmosphere back to the boardroom.
Reginald's first marriage, Kathleen Nielsen, produced one daughter, but ended in divorce amid allegations of his drinking and gambling and ended absence.
His second marriage, in 1923, was to Gloria Morgan, a beautiful sister who was 24 years his junior.
Gloria was 17 when they wed. Reginald was 42. A year later, they had a daughter, also named Gloria.
And a year after that, in 1925, Reginald was dead. Cirrhosis of the liver killed Reginald Vanderbilt at age 45.
Decades of drinking had destroyed his body as surely as his gambling had destroyed his fortune.
When his estate was settled, the debts exceeded the assets.
The great-grandson of the Commodore had died broke. His 18-month-old daughter would inherit the income from a trust fund, but everything else was gone.
Little Gloria Vanderbilt would come, in 1934, the subject of what newspapers called the trial of the century.
Her mother and her aunt, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, fought for custody of the child in a courtroom drama that captivated Depression-era America. The trial exposed the Vanderbilt family's dysfunction to public scrutiny, with testimony about Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt's alleged affairs, her neglect of her daughter, her extravagant lifestyle supported by trust fund income. The newspapers called Little Gloria the poor little rich girl, a phrase that captured the strange tragedy of inheriting wealth, but not stability, bearing a famous name, but not the capacity to live up to it. Gertrude Whitney won custody. She was herself an heiress, the daughter of Cornelius II, who had married into the Whitney family and used her fortune to pursue a career as a sculptor and arts patron.
She founded the Whitney Museum of American Art and lived a life of creative accomplishment that distinguished her from most of her relatives. Under her guardianship, little Gloria survived the wreckage of her parents' lives and eventually came to trust fund. Age 21, Gloria Vanderbilt would become famous in her own right, not for railroads or mansions but for fashion design. Her blue jeans, introduced in the 1970s with her name embroidered on the back pocket, sold millions of pairs and generated substantial royalties.
She married 4 times, wrote memoirs, painted, designed, and lived a life that constantly reinvented itself. Her son Anderson Cooper became a prominent television journalist, carrying the Vanderbilt name into the 21st century. But Gloria was clear-eyed about what she had inherited. It's interesting. Hold an interview. I'm one of the few Vanderbilts who's made money. The Manhattan mansions not survive. The commercial development of Fifth Avenue, accelerating through the 1920s, made residential property along that boulevard increasingly valuable for office and retail use. Alice Vanderbilt, Cornelius II's widow, held onto her massive townhouse until 1926, then sold it for $7 million to developers who demolished it and built the Bergdorf Goodman department store.
William Kissam's Petit Chateau fell the same year, replaced by an office tower.
The triple palace that William Henry had built lasted until the 1940s, when it too was demolished.
By 1947, every one of the Vanderbilt mansions on Fifth Avenue was gone, replaced by commercial buildings that generated steady income for their owners but carried no memory of the families that once lived there.
The Newport cottages fared better, at least in terms of physical survival. The Breakers and Marble House and several other Vanderbilt properties were eventually donated to or purchased by the Preservation Society of Newport County, which operates them as museums. Hundreds of thousands of tourists visit each year, walking through the rooms where Cornelius II and his wife entertained, marveling at the marble and gilt and imported antiques. The houses survived because they became public attractions, generating admission fees and donations that covered their maintenance.
They survived by ceasing to be homes.
The railroad, the foundation of everything, was also changing. The New York Central system remained one of the largest and most important railroads in America through the first half of the 20th century, but the industry faced challenges that no amount of Vanderbilt money could overcome. The automobile, growing from a novelty to a necessity in the early decades of the century, captured passengers who had once traveled by train.
Trucks, operating on publicly funded highways, siphoned freight traffic that had once moved exclusively by rail. Airlines, after World War II, hit the lucrative long-distance passenger market almost entirely. The railroads, burdened by heavy infrastructure costs and stringent regulation, struggled to compete.
Harold Sterling Vanderbilt, a great-grandson of the Commodore through William Kissam's line, was the last family member to play a significant role in the railroad business. He served on the board of the New York Central until 1954, maintaining a connection to the enterprise that his great-grandfather had.
Harold was also a yachtsman of international reputation, winning the America's Cup 3 times. He's credited with inventing contract bridge, a card game that became one of the most popular in the world.
He was talented, accomplished, and financially secure,
but he could not save the railroad. In 1968, the New York Central merged with the Pennsylvania Railroad on the Penn Central Transportation Company. The merger was supposed to create efficiencies that would allow both railroads to survive in an increasingly competitive environment.
Instead, it created chaos.
The two companies had incompatible cultures, incompatible computer systems, incompatible labor contracts. Management fought over everything from the location of headquarters to the color of locomotives.
The combined company lost money from the first day, hemorrhaging cash at a rate that stunned even pessimistic observers.
On June 21, 1970, Penn Central declared bankruptcy.
It was the largest bankruptcy in American history to that point, the collapse of a company that had once been considered one of the cornerstones of American capitalism. The federal government eventually intervened, creating Amtrak to take over passenger service and Conrail to operate freight service in the railroad that the Commodore had built. The enterprise that had funded palaces and parties and philanthropies for a century passed from private control into public ownership.
There were no Vanderbilts on the Penn Central board when it failed.
The family had long since diversified its investments, selling railroad shares in favor of bonds and real estate and other securities that seemed safer than the troubled transportation sector. But the symbolism was unavoidable.
The source of Vanderbilt wealth, the industry that had made the name synonymous with American capitalism, was bankrupt. The empire that one man had built from a single sailboat was gone. How do we assess the Vanderbilt legacy? The question is more complicated than it might appear.
By one measure, the family was an astonishing failure. The Commodore accumulated a fortune greater than the United States Treasury. Within 4 generations, his descendants were not merely poor but forgotten, names surviving only in university buildings and museum wings. The wealth dissipated so completely that when 120 Vanderbilts Vanderbilt University in reportedly not one of the other families that built fortunes in the same era. The Rockefellers and Fords and Duponts maintained their wealth across generations, establishing trusts and foundations and family offices served capital, even as the founding industries declined. The Vanderbilts did none of this.
They spent their money and watched it disappear. But this assessment, while accurate, may miss something important. The Commodore built his fortune by recognizing opportunities in transportation, first in steamships and then in railroads. His insight was that America's growth required efficient movement of people and goods, and that whoever controlled the arteries of commerce would prosper.
He was right, spectacularly right, for the era in which he lived. But the transportation industry continued to evolve after his death.
and the railroads that seemed like permanent monopolies became vulnerable to trucks and automobiles and airplanes.
The Vanderbilt fortune depended on an industry that was already mature by the time the third generation came of age. Unlike the Rockefellers, whose oil business continued to grow throughout the century, Vanderbilts were riding a declining asset. Moreover, the Vanderbilts faced a cultural challenge that may have been more destructive than any external force.
The Commodore had built his fortune through relentless work, through discipline and cunning, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. His children and grandchildren inherited the money, but not the mindset. They grew up wealthy, surrounded by luxury, trained from birth to occupy a position rather than to create one.
The skills that had built a fortune, the willingness to take risks and endure hardship and outwork competitors, were precisely the skills that comfortable inheritance made unnecessary. Why struggle when you could simply spend? The spending, of course, was legendary.
The mansions on Fifth Avenue and Newport, the costume balls and European tours, the yachts and racehorses and art collections, all of these consumed capital at a rate that even Vanderbilting could not sustain indefinitely.
When combined with division among multiple heirs and taxation by increased aggressive government, spending ensured that each generation would have less than the one before.
The trajectory was arithmetically inevitable.
Only the timing was uncertain. Could the Vanderbilts have preserved their fortune? Perhaps.
If William Henry had not divided the estate among his children, the third generation had lived more modestly.
If the family had established trusts and foundations to protect capital from spendthrift heirs.
If they had diversified earlier and more aggressively into growing industries. If they had maintained family unity and professional management of shared assets. Other families with similar origins did all of these things.
The Vanderbilts did not.
But perhaps the question itself is wrong. Perhaps we should not ask whether the Vanderbilts could have preserved their fortune, but whether preservation was ever the point.
The Commodore built his empire through competition, through the drive to win that made him willing to sacrifice everything else.
He did not care about being liked or remembered fondly.
He cared about beating his rivals, about demonstrating that he was smarter and tougher and more determined than anyone else.
When he died, he was the richest man in America.
That was the prize he had, and he had won it.
His descendants sought different prizes. William Henry wanted security and respectability. He achieved them.
The third generation wanted social acceptance, and they achieved it, breaking through the barriers that had excluded their grandparents from New York's highest circles. The fourth generation wanted pleasure and freedom. They pursued these things with enthusiasm, if not always with wisdom. Each generation defined success differently, and each achieved what it sought. If the fortune disappeared in the process, perhaps that was an acceptable cost for lives lived according to desires rather than family obligations.
There is something almost biblical about the Vanderbilt story. The rise and fall that spans 4 generations and 90 years, beginning with a ferryman's son and ending with heirs who could not afford their own mansions.
The wealth came from nowhere and returned to nowhere, leaving behind only buildings and names and the memory of extravagance.
It is a story about America, about the possibilities of capitalism and the limits of inheritance, about what money can buy and what it cannot preserve. It is a story about families, about the bonds that hold people together and the pressures that tear them apart. It is a story about time, about how quickly circumstances change and how little control we have over the forces that shape our lives.
The Commodore lies buried in the Moravian Cemetery on Staten Island, the same community where he was born, where he operated his ferry, where his family had lived for generations before him. The mausoleum that his son William Henry built to house the family remains there still, a granite structure designed by Richard Morris Hunt, the architect of so many Vanderbilt mansions. Inside rest the Commodore and his wives, William Henry and his wife, and various other family members who chose to return to the place where everything began. Staten Island itself has changed beyond recognition since 1794. The ferries still run, but they are operated by the city government now, not by private entrepreneurs.
The harbour is cleaner than it was in Commodore's day, but also quieter. The great steamship lines are replaced by container ships and cruise ships. The occasional sail.
Manhattan shimmers across the water. Skyline trans 1,000 times. Boy Cornelius first saw a father's boat.
The world has moved on.
In the archives of the New York Public Library, the files of historical societies and university libraries, in the pages of books and magazines and papers, the Vanderbilt story survives. Scholars debate the family's business practices.
Tourists visit the surviving mansions. Students at Vanderbilt University walk past buildings named for a man most of them could not identify.
The name persists even as the fortune fades, a ghost of Gilded Age ambition that haunts the American imagination. What does it mean to inherit wealth? The Vanderbilts answered that question in every way possible. Some inherited responsibly, managing their portions carefully and passing them on to their children.
Some inherited recklessly, gambling and drinking and spending until nothing remained.
Some inherited ambivalently, uncertain whether the money was a blessing or a curse, whether the name was an asset or a burden.
They were not unusual in this regard. Every wealthy family faces the same questions, the same tensions between preservation and consumption, between family unity and individual desire. The Vanderbilts were unusual only in the scale of their wealth and the completeness of failure. The last Vanderbilt to serve on the board of a major railroad stepped down more than 70 years ago.
The last Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue was demolished more than 80 years ago.
The last Vanderbilt to control significant railroad assets lost that control when Penn Central collapsed more than 50 years ago.
The family's economic power is gone, as completely as if it had never existed. What remains is the name. Stories, mansions that have become museums. Perhaps that is enough. The Commodore wanted to be remembered, wanted to prove that a ferryman's son could become the richest man in America.
He succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. His descendants wanted to live well, to enjoy the fruits of wealth that they had not earned, to find meaning in consumption so did not find it in creation. They succeeded too, by their own standards, if not by their grandfathers.
The fortune served its purpose for the people who held it.
That it did not last forever was perhaps less a failure than a fact of life, less a tragedy than a natural conclusion. There is a ferry that still runs between Staten Island and Manhattan, one of the last free commuters serving New York City. Every day, thousands of passengers board the boats and cross the harbor, seeing the same views that young Cornelius Vanderbilt 100 years ago.
The Statue of Liberty rises from its island, a gift from France that arrived after the Commodore's death. The skyscrapers of Lower Manhattan crowd the waterfront, monuments to fortunes made after the railroad era. Ellis Island sits empty now, its days as an immigration station long past. The harbor belongs to everyone and no one, a public resource that private enterprise once fought to control. If the Commodore could see his city today, he would barely recognize it. The waterfront where he learned to sail is covered with parks and promenades. The streets where he fought his business battles are lined with towers of glass and steel. The railroad stations he built have been demolished and rebuilt and demolished again. Even Grand Central Terminal, the monument his son constructed to honor the family name, has been transformed almost beyond recognition. Train shed replaced, its tracks electrified, original glory restored only after decades of neglect.
But perhaps he would recognize something else.
The ambition that drove him, the belief that hard work and cunning could transform a poor boy into a prince, still animates America.
New fortunes rise every generation, built on new technologies and new industries, challenging the old money that once seemed permanent.
The Commodore would understand the entrepreneurs of Silicon Valley, the hedge fund managers of Wall Street, the builders and dreamers who believe they can reshape the world according to their will. He might even approve of them, these new tycoons who have surpassed his wealth by factors of 10 or 100, who have built empires that make his railroad system look modest by comparison. He would not approve of his descendants, the later Vanderbilts, who squandered what he had built.
He had warned them, in his blunt and profane way, that wealth required vigilance, that fortunes could disappear as quickly as they made.
They had not listened.
They had assumed that Vanderbilt money would last forever. The name itself was worth more than the assets behind it.
They were wrong. The money ran out.
The mansions fell.
The railroad collapsed. And the name, once synonymous with unlimited wealth, became instead a cautionary tale. Any fool can make a fortune.
It takes a man of brains to hold on to it.
So the Commodore allegedly told his son, William Henry. William Henry took advice to heart, doubling the fortune he inherited. But William Henry's sons and grandsons did not take the advice, or perhaps they did not have the brains to follow it.
The fortune that had taken one man's lifetime to accumulate took 4 generations to...
It was not stolen or confiscated or lost in any dramatic catastrophe. It simply drained away, dollar by dollar, party by party, mansion by mansion, until nothing remained but memory. The January snow still falls on Manhattan sometimes, muffling the sounds of the city, covering the streets where the Commodore once walked. The ferries still cross the harbor, though they are operated by the Metropolitan Transportation Authority now. The trains still run into Grand Central, though they carry commuters rather than through passengers bound for Chicago.
The world has changed, is changing, will continue to change. And somewhere in that change, the Vanderbilt story finds its meaning.
They were not heroes.
The Commodore built his fortune through methods that would be illegal today, crushing competitors and manipulating markets and buying politicians when necessary. His descendants contributed little to society beyond the construction of beautiful buildings and the employment of servants.
They were not villains either, not by the standards of their time or ours. Just people who had more money than they knew what to do with, spent it in the ways that seemed natural to them. They lived and died and passed their money on, and eventually the money was gone. Perhaps that is the most honest summary of the Vanderbilt legacy. They had unlimited wealth, and it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to secure their social position forever.
It wasn't enough to protect them from the forces that transformed the American economy.
It wasn't enough to overcome the fundamental challenge of generational wealth transfer, the difficulty of passing not just money but wisdom and discipline from one generation to the next.
They had more than almost anyone in history. They still lost it all.
The Commodore would not have been surprised. He had started with nothing, and he understood how fragile success could be. He had watched competitors rise and fall, had seen fortunes made and lost in a single market panic, had known from experience that yesterday's victory guaranteed nothing about.
He tried to prepare his heirs for this reality, tried to concentrate the fortune and install competent management and maintain family discipline. But he could not control what happened after his death. No one can.
And so the story ends where it began, with snow falling on a great city, with fortunes rising and falling, with families struggling to preserve what they have built. The Vanderbilts are gone as a financial power, but they remain as a symbol. Reminder that wealth is temporary and that legacy depends on more than money.
Their mansions have become museums. Their name adorns a university and an avenue and a few surviving monuments.
Their story has become part of American mythology, a tale of ambition and excess and the fleeting nature of all human achievement. The ferries still run, the trains still travel, the snow still falls, and somewhere, a young person with nothing but ambition is looking at Manhattan's glittering skyline and wondering whether they might build something that will last. The Commodore would understand that feeling.
He had felt it himself 200 years ago on a boat in the harbor, dreaming of an empire that hadn't been built yet.
He had made that dream real.
His descendants had failed to preserve it.
But the dream itself, the American dream of success through effort, survives in every ferry passenger and train commuter and ambitious young person who believes that tomorrow might be different from today. That is perhaps the truest Vanderbilt legacy.
Not the money, which is gone.
Not the mansions, which are museums. Not even the railroad, which belongs to the government now. But the example, positive and negative, of what wealth can do and what it cannot buy. The Commodore showed that a poor boy could become the richest man in America.
His descendants showed that even the richest family could lose everything in a few generations.
Together, they told a story about America that Americans still struggle to understand.
Unlimited wealth wasn't enough.
It never is. The measure of a life is not what you accumulate, but what you create. Not what you inherit, but what you build. Not how much you spend, but what you leave behind. The Commodore understood this. In his crude and ruthless way, he built something that lasted nearly a century, that employed tens of thousands of people, that transformed the way Americans traveled and shipped goods.
That his descendants failed to maintain it does not diminish his achievement.
It only reminds us that every achievement is temporary, every fortune is fragile, that even the mightiest empires eventually fall. The snow is still falling, the city is still dreaming, and somewhere in the archives, in the mansions, in the memories of those who study the past, Vanderbilts wait to tell their story again.
It is a story without heroes or villains, without clear lessons or easy morals, without the neat resolutions that fiction provides.
It is simply what happened. Rise and fall of an American dynasty, told not to praise or condemn, but to understand. Understanding may be the greatest legacy of all. The fourth generation faced challenges that their parents could barely have imagined.
The introduction of federal income taxation in 1913 created a new and permanent drain on wealth. The estate tax, imposed on transfers of property at death, meant that each generation of transition would cost the family a substantial portion of its accumulated capital.
The combination of these taxes with the traditional Vanderbilt spending habits guaranteed a declining trajectory that no amount of it could entirely reverse.
Consider the mathematics of dynastic wealth preservation.
If a fortune generates annual returns of 5%, but faces combined income and state taxes 30%, the real return after taxes is. Add to this the normal expenses of wealthy living, the maintenance of properties, the support of family members, and the charitable obligations expected of prominent families. Wealth barely keeps pace with inflation. Add further the Vanderbilt habit of spectacular spending, of parties and yachts and racehorses and failed marriages, and the fortune inevitably shrinks with each passing year. The railroad industry itself was entering a period of difficulty that would last for decades.
Government regulation, established by the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 and strengthened by subsequent legislation, limited the pricing flexibility that had generated monopoly profits in earlier years.
Competition from trucks, automobiles, and later airplanes captured traffic that had once moved exclusively by rail. Labor unions, growing in power throughout the early 20th century, demanded wages and benefits that compressed profit margins. The railroads remained important, but they were no longer the engines of wealth creation that they had been in the Commodore's day. The New York Central, the jewel of the Vanderbilt Empire, struggled along with the rest of the industry. Management worked to reduce costs and improve efficiency, but the fundamental economics of the business had changed. Passenger traffic, which had once been a significant revenue source, became a money-losing obligation that regulators would not allow the railroad to abandon. Freight traffic faced competition from trucking companies that operated on publicly funded highways without the burden of maintaining their own right-of-way.
The infrastructure that Commodore had built, which had seemed like a permanent advantage, became a millstone around the neck of his successors.
The First World War provided a temporary boost to railroad revenues, as the government commandeered the rails for military purposes and guaranteed profits to the operating.
But the aftermath brought new problems.
The railroad administration had demonstrated that government operation was possible, raising the specter of nationalization that would haunt the industry for decades.
Post-war recession tested the railroad's financial resilience, and many failed to pass the test.
The Vanderbilt line survived, but they no longer dominated the industry as they had in earlier decades.
The 1920s brought a forced prosperity that masked the underlying decline. Stock prices rose, dividends flowed. Vanderbilt heirs continued their established lifestyles without apparent difficulty.
The mansions were maintained, the parties continued, social calendar proceeded as it always had. But informed observers could see the warning signs.
Railroad traffic was not growing as fast as the economy.
Competition was intensifying. The capital investments needed to maintain competitiveness were becoming harder to finance. The Golden Age was ending, even if the participants refused to acknowledge it. The crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed exposed the vulnerability of inherited wealth. Stock prices collapsed, dividend payments were suspended, and the income streams that had supported Vanderbilt lifestyles rated almost overnight.
Family members who had never economized found themselves forced to reduce expenses, to sell properties, to dismiss servants.
The Depression did not destroy the Vanderbilt fortune in itself, but it accelerated a decline that had been underway for decades. The railroad industry's response to the Depression was consolidation and cost-cutting, neither of which provided a long-term solution to structural problems. The New York Central merged routes with competitor lines, eliminated redundant facilities, and reduced employment drastically. But the fundamental challenges remained. The automobile had captured the short-haul passenger market almost entirely. Trucks were taking an increasing share of freight traffic. Airlines were beginning to attract long-distance passengers would once have traveled by train. The railroad was becoming a legacy industry, important but no longer central to the American economy.
World War II provided another temporary respite.
Military traffic overwhelmed the transportation system, and every available railcar and locomotive was pressed into service. The government again guaranteed profits, allowing the railroads to accumulate capital that would be needed for post-war modernization. But the war also accelerated the trends that threatened the industry's future. The massive expansion of highway infrastructure, justified by military necessity, made trucking more competitive. The development of commercial aviation, building on wartime advances in aircraft technology, created a new industry, eventually dominate long-distance travel. The post-war era brought challenges that the Vanderbilts and other railroad families could not overcome. Passenger traffic collapsed as Americans embraced the automobile. Interstate highways, funded by federal gasoline taxes, provided trucks with a subsidized alternative to rail freight. Airline deregulation in the 1970s further reduced the cost of air travel, capturing the remaining premium passenger traffic. The railroads that had once dominated American transportation found themselves fighting for survival in an economy that had moved beyond them. The Penn Central merger of 1968 was supposed to save the railroad industry in the Northeast, combining the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad into a single entity large enough to achieve the economies of scale necessary for profitability. The logic seemed compelling. Both railroads served many of the same markets, operated parallel lines, rationalized, and faced similar challenges that nation might address. Together, they would be stronger than either could be alone. The reality proved catastrophic.
The two companies had different cultures, different operating systems, different labor contracts, and different visions for the future.
Managers from the former New York Central and the former Pennsylvania Railroad fought over everything from headquarters location to locomotive paint schemes. The computer systems that each railroad had developed could not communicate with each other. causing confusion in freight tracking and billing. Labor unions, protective of their members' jobs, resisted every effort at rationalization. The combined company lost money from the first day of operation.
The Penn Central bankruptcy of June 1970 was the largest in American history. The collapse of a company that once been considered a pillar of American capitalism.
The federal government was forced to intervene, creating Amtrak to take over passenger service and eventually Conrail to operate freight service in the East. The railroad that the Commodore had built, the enterprise that had funded generations of Vanderbilt extravagance, passed from private control into public ownership. It was the end of an era that had begun when a young ferryman borrowed $100 from his mother. The Vanderbilts who survived into the late 20th century bore little resemblance to their founding ancestor.
Gloria Vanderbilt, great-great-granddaughter of the Commodore, built a successful fashion business that traded on her name rather than her industries. Her designer jeans, introduced in the 1970s with her signature embroidered on the back pocket, sold millions of pairs and generated royalties, provided comfortable living for decades.
It was a genuine achievement, a demonstration that entrepreneurial talent could emerge even in families that had long ceased to produce it.
But it was a far cry from building railroad empires.
Anderson Cooper, Gloria's son and the Commodore's great-great-great-grandson, became a successful television journalist, earning his living through talent and hard work rather than inherited wealth.
His mother was clear with him from an early age that there would be no inheritance, that the Vanderbilt fortune was gone, that he would have to make his own way in the world. This proved to be a gift, liberating him from the burden of living up to a legacy and allowing him to build something of his own. Cooper has written and spoken about his family's history, approaching it with the detachment of a journalist rather than the defensiveness of an heir.
The mansions that survive tell their own story of wealth and its limitations.
Biltmore remains in Vanderbilt hands, operated as a tourist attraction and winery that generates the income necessary for maintenance.
The Breakers and Marble House are museums, maintained by preservation societies that charge admission visitors who want to glimpse how the other half live. The Fifth Avenue mansions are gone entirely, their sites occupied by commercial buildings that serve purposes unimaginable to their original inhabitants. The physical monuments to Vanderbilt wealth have either been demolished, converted to public use, or transformed into businesses.
None remains a private residence for a private family. The name Vanderbilt persists in ways that would have pleased the Commodore. Vanderbilt University, which received his donation of $1 million in 1873, has grown into one of America's leading research institutions. Its sports teams called the Commodores in honor of their benefactor.
Vanderbilt Avenue in Manhattan commemorates the family's importance to the Vanderbilt mansions in Newport draw hundreds of thousands of visitors each year, sustaining interest in Gilded Age and the families that...
These memorials ensure that the name will be remembered even as the wealth has disappeared.
What lessons can be drawn from the Vanderbilt experience? The temptation to moralize is strong. Conclude that wealth corrupts, or that inheritance destroys ambition, or that no fortune can survive indefinitely. But such conclusions may be too simple. Some wealthy families have maintained their positions for generations, establishing trusts and foundations and family offices that preserve capital through prudent management. The Vanderbilts could have done the same.
They chose not to, or more precisely, each generation made choices that seemed reasonable at the time, but proved destructive in aggregate.
The Commodore chose to concentrate his fortune in one son, believing that division would weaken the family's power.
William Henry chose to divide his fortune among children, believing that fairness required equal treatment. The grandchildren chose to spend lavishly on mansions and entertainment, believing that social position required spectacular display.
The great-grandchildren chose to pursue pleasure over business, believing that their inherited wealth would provide indefinitely. Each choice reflected the circumstances and values of its moment.
None was obviously wrong in isolation,
but together they ensured that the fortune would dissipate.
There is also the matter of luck.
Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt might have provided the leadership that the family needed, had he not died on the Lusitania. Cornelius too might have lived longer and managed the transition to the fourth generation more carefully, his health not failed. The railroad industry might have remained profitable longer, had technology not created competing modes of transportation. Many factors beyond the family's control contributed to its decline. Fortune, in both senses of the word, played a role in the outcome. Perhaps the most honest assessment acknowledges that Vanderbilt's story is neither tragedy nor morality tale, a record of what actually happened to one family over 1 century in one country. They rose from poverty to unimaginable wealth in a single generation. They maintained that wealth for 2 more generations while adapting to changed circumstances.
They lost most of it in the 4th generation as their industry declined and their spending continued. By the fifth generation, they were ordinary citizens, distinguished only by their name and the memories it evoked. It is a pattern that many wealthy families have followed, a reminder that all things pass and that permanence is an illusion.
The harbour where the Commodore began his career still flows past Staten Island and Manhattan, still carrying vessels between boroughs and beyond. The ferries that run today are descendants of the boats that young Cornelius operated, although they are operated by the city government now rather than private entrepreneurs. The passengers who ride them probably do not think about Vanderbilts, probably do not know that the transportation they enjoy for free was once the foundation of his greatest fortune. The history is there for those who seek it. Most people have other concerns, and perhaps that is appropriate. The Commodore would not have wanted to be a museum exhibit or a cautionary tale. He wanted to win, to accumulate, to dominate.
He achieved all of these things in his lifetime.
What happened after his death was, speaking, not his concern. He had done his part, had built something enormous from nothing, had proven that ability and determination could overcome any obstacle.
If his descendants failed to maintain what he had built, it was their failure, not his.
The Commodore's legacy was complete the moment he died. Everything since has been epilogue. The snow falls on Manhattan as it did when the Commodore lay dying, as it will fall long after everyone who remembers the Vanderbilts has passed away.
The city continues its restless commerce, creating new fortunes and destroying old ones, elevating new families and forgetting those that came before.
The great names of one generation become footnotes of the next, the towering figures of one era becoming the historical curiosity of another. The Vanderbilts have joined this procession of the forgotten famous, their story known to scholars and enthusiasts, but not to the general public, their mansions preserved as artifacts of a vanished world.
Yet the questions they raise remain relevant.
How should wealth be created and maintained? How should families balance individual desires against collective interests?
How should society regard the accumulation of vast fortunes?
How should inheritance be structured to promote both individual freedom and family continuity? The Vanderbilts did not answer these questions definitively. They simply lived out one possible set of answers, demonstrating through their experience what works and what does not. Their story is data for the ongoing human experiment with wealth and its consequences.
The ferries still run. The trains still travel. The harbour still connects Staten Island to Manhattan, as it has for centuries before the Vanderbilts and will for centuries after. The boy who borrowed $100 from his mother and built an empire has been dead for nearly 150 years now. His descendants are scattered and ordinary. His fortune is gone.
His name persists in buildings and streets and universities, but the power behind that name has vanished entirely. What remains is the story, told and retold, of ambition and achievement and decline.
It is a story about America, about capitalism, about families, about time. It is a story that ends, as all stories do, but whose meaning continues old for those who care to seek it.
The Commodore would have understood.
He had seen fortunes rise and fall throughout his long life, had watched competitors who seemed invincible succumb to changing circumstances, had known from experience that success was never permanent.
He built his empire anyway, not because he believed it would last forever, but because building was what he did, who he was, what gave his life meaning.
His descendants may have failed to preserve what he created, but they could not diminish his achievement. He had done what he set out to do.
The rest was beyond his control, and so the Vanderbilt story concludes, not with a bang, but with a whisper, not with catastrophe, gradual fading, not with drama, but with the simple passage of time, reduces all human endeavour to memory, and then to nothing.
The unlimited wealth wasn't enough because nothing is ever enough. The universe is larger than any fortune and outlasts every dynasty.
The Vanderbilts learn this lesson as all wealthy families eventually do. Their experience reminds us that we are mortal, that our achievements are temporary, and that the true measure of a life cannot be counted in dollars or mansions or miles of railroad track.
They had everything that money could buy. In the end, it wasn't enough. But that is not a counsel of despair.
It is simply a recognition of reality, an acknowledgement that wealth is a means rather than an end, that what matters ultimately is how we live rather than what we accumulate.
The Commodore lived a life of fierce purpose, building something that changed his country. His descendants lived lives of varying quality, some meaningful and some empty, some productive and some wasteful.
The money that passed through their hands was neither good nor evil in itself. It was simply a resource that could be used well or badly. They used it according to their natures and their circumstances, and history has recorded the results. The harbour is quiet now, the water dark beneath the winter sky. The snow has stopped falling, leaving the city blanketed in white.
Tomorrow the ferries will run again, carrying passengers who know nothing of the Vanderbilts and care nothing about railroad history. The city will continue its endless cycle of creation and destruction, building new fortunes and forgetting old ones.
and somewhere in the archives, in the museums, in the pages of books that fewer and fewer people read, the Vanderbilt story will wait for those who seek.
It is patient, a story, as all true stories are.
It has been waiting for nearly 150 years already. It can wait a little longer.